Rob Schamberger. Rob, good evening.
Howdy, guys. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thanks for joining us. And first question right out of the bat. I know you've been doing illustrating, painting, comics your whole life. So what got you first started as an artist?
It was back when I was 7 years old. My older stepbrother bought me my first comic book. It was an issue of the Incredible Hulk, and we spent the whole weekend like redrawing everything from it. And I just knew right then, like, okay, this is what I want to do. Art's my thing.
Well, was it just the Incredible Hulk or was it like Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, Superman? How far did you branch out?
I'm a lifelong comic book fan since then. All over the place.
Mm. Do you tend to favor DC, Marvel, or are you just equal with both?
I more follow the creators, the person that's making it. They jump all over the place. But yeah,
That's
it's
true.
it's the people that make it that keep me interested.
Yeah, that's true. The artists, the authors. I mean, Stan Lee's worked for both sides, and
Right.
everybody seems to have worked everywhere at some point. So
Yeah.
I find it interesting personally that you started with the Incredible Hulk because I really got into it in the '90s when Peter David was the writer for it because he was, like you say, when you follow certain people, you follow everything they do. And I already loved his Star Trek novelizations. And then when I found out that he was doing the Incredible Hulk, I was like, man, if Peter David's doing the Incredible Hulk, I have to read it.
And it was fantastic. The last issue of his run was one of the best comic books I've ever read.
Absolutely. It's pretty hard to top the run he had as the lead author at that time. But obviously you have a passion for wrestling too, not just for Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse comics in general, So talk about our wrestling passion that you have here. What got you into wrestling?
I didn't actually get into it till I was about 18. Like every 18-year-old living on his own, I was at my parents' doing laundry. And my stepfather was a fan back in the 60s and 70s here in Kansas City. Like he would go to watch Harley Race and Bulldog Bob Brown and Bob Geigel and all those guys. And he was just flipping through the channels, landed on Nitro. This would have been 98. And Ric Flair was cutting a promo in the ring, and I was just hooked right there. And the next week, like I didn't know the difference between the companies or anything. I just was trying to find wrestling, and landed on Monday Night Raw, which if you look back in '98, they were firing on every single cylinder, and yeah, been a fan since.
Yeah, that was a very hot time to be a wrestling fan between what was going on Nitro on one channel and what was going on Raw on the other channel. And they were always trying to one up each other. So there was a lot to get hooked on right around that time.
Oh yeah, it was great stuff.
Hmm. But, what made you decide at that point, just becoming a fan of it and getting into the product and seeing these two rival companies trying to outdo each other? What made you think, I'd like to paint some of these people?
Well, originally I was wanting to do, like a comic book graphic novel about wrestling, and started a few different projects on that never got completed, unfortunately. But I was also about 3 years ago looking to do something different than comic books and commercial work. Wanted to get into what they call fine art, which is really you just paint what you want and people buy the painting. And I thought, like no one's really seriously done a body of artwork around wrestling. And it just seemed silly to me that it hadn't happened. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to wait for someone else to do it. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And the original thing that I was doing was painting a portrait of every single world champion going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt. So that's about 250 portraits. I'm calling it the Champions Collection. Uh, I've done about 105 out of those 250 so far. Just building towards that. And then, do, other wrestling work on the side. And amazingly, the wrestling community has fully embraced what I'm doing. Like I'm able to do this as a full-time job now, which is incredible. And like when I started it 3 years ago, I did a Kickstarter to make this so that it could be a full-time thing for me. And in a month, I raised $20,000. which was just incredible. And, like for anyone, that'd be incredible. But I've heard, that's one of the more successful art-based Kickstarters, for the fine art category. I hear from other artists all the time that can't believe, how well it did. And they're all like, wrestling? Really? I'm like, hey, man, don't judge. And, like one of the funny things when I was doing that, when I said I was going to do every world champion, people were like, so are you going to do David Arquette? And I'm like, well, yeah, why not? The Triple Cage pay-per-view they did was here in Kansas City. I was there, man. So on a lark, I tweeted David and said, hey, when I get to yours, how do you want it to look? And he enthusiastically replied like, how he's like, man, the red outfit from that. And we ended up going with something else, but he's got that hanging up in his living room now.
Awesome. You
Yeah.
can't really blame him for that because, I mean, people want to hate on him because of that whole situation and how it was booked. But deep down, he's a wrestling fan like anybody else. So you can't blame him for wanting to be immortalized as a fan who got to be a part of it.
And from a booking standpoint, I would have done it too.
Hmm.
Because look, they got promos from Courtney Cox, of course, but also, a lot of other A-list stars that they wouldn't have even been able to pay for. And they got it for free, because their friend David Arquette was champion. And, brought some eyeballs to the show, and that's what it's all about.
Of course, that's always what Vince Russo argues too when people ask him about it. He always says things like, 10 years later, people are still talking about it. But the problem with that, Vince, is that people aren't always saying kind things when they talk about it.
Well, it's better than not being talked about at all, right?
I suppose that's true. Can't argue with that. But when you pick a champion to do, are you trying to go in any way chronologically, or are you just going to jump around a bit?
Uh, my friends that know me pretty well and know how obsessive compulsive I am crack up when I tell them what my method is for this. At my website, robschamberger.com, cheap plug, I have a page dedicated to the Champions Collection, and it's a grid like 4 or 5 wide, and then goes on down, and the way that I pick them is to fill in the blank spots on the grid. Like if there's a big gap of like no paintings, like okay, I need to do one in there, and I try to balance out like not doing all the big names at the beginning because like people would lose interest when it comes to guys from like the later era of USWA or AWA or the early champions like the Frank Gotch era. A lot of those guys aren't known very well. Like when I did Stanislaus Zabisco, like not a lot of people knew who he was, but after I did him, a lot of people found a newfound interest, and especially that real old time stuff, which is kind of the point of the project.
Well, I'm looking at the grid right now, and I can see a gap that you might want to fill from Bobby Colt to Brent Albright. There's about 6 white spots right in the middle there.
That's killing me.
And personally, I'm a big Booker T mark, so I'd love to see your Booker T painting. I'm sure that one will be about pretty darn awesome.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one. I'm sure I'll have to do something with him holding his hand up in front of his face.
Yeah. Or you could do the King Booker where he's got on his crown and his robe if you wanted to go that direction.
I love that gimmick. That
Yeah,
cracked me up.
you and
The
I might
robe.
be the only two because everybody else I knew hated it. They're like, man, he's putting on this fake accent. It's so terrible. I'm like, no, he's getting into it. He's living the spirit of being a king.
King Booker. I loved it. I loved it. Like
Yeah.
that and his feud with Boogeyman were like two of my favorite Booker T things. Like there's that like backstage bit where he's trying to find Charmel and he walks into a room and there's worms everywhere and he just
Oh
goes,
yeah.
worms with his eyes bugging out. It killed me. It's great stuff.
True story for you. I was at the WrestleMania with Booker T and Boogeyman having the match, and I tried to pull out a bag of gummy worms and do the Boogeyman entrance in the crowd, but there was so much smoke from his
Oh,
pyro and that smoke stick that he waved around that nobody could see me on TV.
that's fun.
I tried, but it was an epic fail, as the kids say. So what can you do?
That
I've
would have
got
been
a
a sugar rush.
Yeah, well, it was a sugar rush because I actually ate the gummy worms. Once they
Oh.
were in my mouth, I wasn't just gonna spit them out on the floor and make people walk in them. So we've got about a billion questions from a big fan of yours in our chat room, King J. So without further ado, I'm going to read a few of them for you and you can answer as you choose.
Okay.
He says, you're a huge fan of Picasso. Is there any Picasso piece that has directly inspired you?
Probably the one of all the women with the African masks. The name is escaping me because it's in French. But that was one where not only had he pushed his own style so far with, essentially creating cubism and then, pushing it as far as it would go, but then also getting even further away by incorporating the African style masks in there. Like he had done quite a bit of research into, artwork that was largely unknown in the Eurocentric part of the world. To me, that speaks to me because he was constantly pushing himself, constantly evolving his style, and it's a example that I try to follow.
All right. Well, he has a related question to that. Are there any other artists from the Cubist period, like Picasso, that you also take inspiration from?
Um, None that jump to mind specifically. My art influences are all over the place. Like again the comic book stuff, and then uh, illustration. Like modern American illustration is fascinating to me. And then a few years ago, I really got into what a lot of street artists were doing around the world. All those things. I actually spend about half an hour every morning before I start working just looking at other people's art to inspire me, but also to look at how these artists solved the problems for the pieces that they were doing and seeing how I can incorporate that into my own approach.
Very cool. Now, he wants to know, have you ever faced undue criticism for your focus on the Champions Collection and doing wrestlers as opposed to other famous athletes like basketball players or football players or what have you?
Um, Not really. Probably only for my dad. He keeps asking me when I'm going to do a real sport, and I say when I've failed at life. Um, I, there's a lot of other really good artists doing the other sports stuff, and they're doing it, and their work really looks well because they really enjoy the sport that they're portraying. I'm not actually a big sports fan. I was that nerdy kid in school that was reading his comic books and drawing and sci-fi and fantasy and all that stuff, which I think is part of why wrestling appealed to me. And more of the performance art side of it than I can still definitely appreciate the athleticism of all the guys, and I've become so good friends with so many of them. Like I see like the toll that it takes on their bodies, but also the amount of work that they put into to go out and put on those amazing shows. But yeah, like if I started doing like basketball, right, I would just be another guy doing basketball art. And ultimately, right now, I'm the guy doing wrestling art, and that's a good place to be.
Yeah, that's a good niche. In fact, I'll segue away from Jeff's questions for one of my own for a minute. I've noticed that from time to time, a painting of yours will show up on WWE for a charity auction. So how did you forge that relationship to get your artwork auctioned through them?
Yeah, we started talking about halfway through last year. I'd been on their radar going back to the original Kickstarter, but about halfway through last year, we started having a lot of talks about how we could work together. And the first thing that we started with were the auctions. We haven't done any charity ones yet, but that's something that we are working towards.
Oh, my mistake. I apologize.
No problem. It's right now it's keeping my lights on instead. It's the Rob Schamberger Benevolent Fund. Um, and like that's the first thing that we started with, and now leading into WrestleMania, I'll be doing live art at Access all 4 days, and it's not just for the Access sessions. Like I'll be set up right outside of the Superstore in the convention center there, and I think the doors open around like 11 or noon each day, and that's free to the public. So, people can come in, watch me doing the art. I'll also have original paintings there for sale. And then there's all the amazing stuff in the superstore too.